delighted to have the opportunity to share with you some of my experiences. Listening to Dave speak before, I was thinking that almost everything I'll say today it's like he was giving a preface for it, because the group that I was in, the Unification Church, more popularly known as the Moonies, clearly is something that came out of all that Protestant ferment. And the guy who was our leader, Mr. Moon, again, listening to Dave talk, I can see just elements of that stuff in Mr. Moon's teaching over and over and over again. Before I launch into my remarks, I do want to just acquaint you with me a little bit. I joined the Unification Church, the Moonies, in 1969. I was 22 years old. I was there for 4.5 years. I left when I was 26. People ask me sometimes, how did an intelligent guy like you, an articulate guy like you, get sucked into a stupid, destructive cult group? And I say, well, it was very easy. It's called innocence and ignorance. 22, I didn't know anything. And when I bumped into these people, they were very friendly, very warm, very loving. And I just hitchhiked across the country from New Jersey all the way out to California. I didn't know a soul. And I was in Berkeley, and I made the mistake, or maybe it wasn't a mistake, of asking a guy on Berkeley campus if I could borrow his pencil. And it turned out he had joined the Moonies 3 days before. And he had no idea who they were either. So I borrowed his pencil, and then I wrote a little note, and the note said, "Can you help me find a place to stay while I look for a job?" And then I held a note up to this guy whose name was Michael, and Michael said, "Yeah, I know where you can keep your stuff." And I said, "Where?" He said, "Well, it's this great place called the Unified Family." He said, "I just joined them 3 days ago." And I said, "Okay." He picked up one of my bags, I picked up the other. We went down there, and then over the next 7 or 8 days, I heard pretty much their entire teaching. And by the end of it, they were telling me that Mr. Moon, the founder of the organization, was the Messiah, that he was the successor of Jesus Christ. And at that time, I was very sort of spiritually open. I was very interested in religious stuff. I'd been studying yoga. I was meditating and praying. And it just all seemed to fit in. And then when I was there, one of the nights I went to hear a lecture, I spent the night there. And when I spent the night there, we were like a bunch, 5 or 6 guys sleeping on the floor in this sort of big common room. And I didn't have anything to sleep on. They said, "Go in the closet and get a sleeping bag." So I opened the closet up, and I looked up where all the sleeping bags were, and there was a picture of Mr. Moon. And he was black hair, and he had on a kimono, and he was about maybe 35 or 40. He looked very intense. And I looked at that picture, and my mind said, this is before they told me he was the Messiah, my mind said, they're going to tell me he's the Messiah. And then, of course, when they did, I thought, wow, this is really interesting. And, of course, when I saw that picture, just to understand my personal psychology, you need to know that I had a positive prejudice towards the Orient and towards Buddhism. And so here was this religious leader who was, he looked the part. And my little brain went, yeah, this is great. Anyway, one thing led to another, and I wound up joining, and I was there for 3 months, and then I came back to Washington, D.C., to the national headquarters. And I was in that area for the next 4.5 years. And I rose up through the ranks, and after I'd been in the organization for 16 months, I was made the chief political officer for the Moonies for all of North America. And at that time, I then went on a trip to Asia. I went out to Korea and Japan, and to Vietnam and Cambodia, and I met Mr. Moon personally, and I was quite convinced when I saw him and met him, and also when I saw the Japanese Unification Church, I was quite convinced that this organization was going to take control of the world. There was so much power and so much energy there that it just kind of bowled me over. The other thing is that when I was a workshop director and trainer and teacher for the Unification Church in the state of Maryland, I did it pretty much every weekend for 2 years. We would recruit students from the University of Maryland, and we'd bring them out to our house in Upper Marlboro, And we'd spend 2 or 3 days with them, projecting our teaching into them, and with the workshop staff, we would just be love bombing them, trying to open them up emotionally and trying to provide them with powerful emotional experiences. And when I was a presenter at these workshops, one of the things I would say at the beginning of the workshop is, we're so glad you're all here. We really welcome you here. And I know that throughout the course of the weekend, some of you will have questions. So what I'd like to do now is just invite you to hold your questions till the end. And so what I want to say to you all in this little conference here is, don't hold your questions till the end. Please feel free to stop me and question me at any point, and I'll do my best to try to answer your question. If I don't know the answer, I'll tell you. You can ask Dave or somebody, or Mark or somebody, or Jan. So the other thing is that a lot of my remarks will be influenced by and shaped by the fact that for the last 27 years I have been a drug and alcohol counselor. And I've worked with alcoholics and addicts in state prisons, county jails, parole offices, and probation offices. And I retired from that profession in September of 2013, but I still do about 10 hours a week of counseling with DWI clients. And one of the things that surfaced for me in this career working with alcoholics and addicts is there's a tremendous parallel between the psychology of the addict or the psychology of somebody who is drug dependent and the psychology of somebody who has fallen into a destructive cult, somebody who has been brainwashed, somebody who's been subjected to thought reform, somebody who has lived through the kinds of experiences that Dave was cataloging for us this morning. So there are many, many parallels between these. So that having been said, I'm going to kind of take you to my little display here. This is my favorite thing. It's one of the little red pointers. It's a symbol of authority and love. So I say, addict, idol, and cult member, reflections on the loss of self. And what's going to follow here is 7 statements which, for me, define what a destructive cult is. And in this instance, we're describing a destructive cult of the religious character. That is, a destructive cult which uses religious language and religious metaphor as a means for penetrating your defenses and getting a hold of your thinking process. That's what this is about. So number 1 is, or number A is, it says, what does an extremist organization look like? Number 1 is, you have an absolute leader. Well, what's the difference between this absolute leader and your local minister, parish priest, rabbi? The difference is this absolute leader is in direct contact with God 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. And so when you're inside the organization, your relationship to that leader is, if you can imagine, somebody in the first century who was around Jesus and they thought that he was the Son of God, it's like that's what you were thinking about this person. This person isn't just a nice guy. This person isn't just a nice person or somebody with good morals. This is somebody who knows the truth. They can see the entire past, the entire future. They're a God, in fact, is what they are. So with this absolute leader comes an absolute teaching. This teaching is a little bit different from, going to Sunday school. Like, where I grew up in Princeton, New Jersey, there was an Episcopal church, there was a Baptist church, there was a Catholic church. You could go to Sunday school and you would learn moral lessons. You might study parts of the Bible or something, but it was kind of low-key. In this situation, this leader brings with him or her the absolute final truth. This is not something you can argue with. It's the final revelation from God. So again, when you're inside the organization, you're no longer thinking about what anybody else said. You're not thinking about some other religious leader or teachers, anything that is a reference to some earlier person. Maybe it's St. Francis or Buddha or whoever. What they would say is, that's nice, that's nice. That person was preparing for this. That person was preparing for Mr. Moon, in my case, for Sun Myung Moon. So this teaching is not about dialogue. It's not about thinking about stuff. It's about acknowledging that you're now in the presence of total knowledge, and so you don't need to search anymore. You don't need to question anymore. C, the third thing is the hierarchical social structure. Again, I refer back to Dave's remarks about many of these groups, or maybe all of these groups, and say that the social structure is hierarchical. It's a pyramid. So what's a good example of a pyramid in our history? Well, go back to ancient Egypt. It's the Pharaoh, the god king, who's at the top of Egyptian civilization. And the meaning of your life, the meaning of who you are, is dependent on your relationship to the Pharaoh. You step outside of that social structure, you no longer have any meaning. You no longer have any value. So here's a question for you on the front row, just for fun. What's a good example of a hierarchical social structure in the 20th century or the 21st century?
I can just think of like Amway.
Sure, Amway, sure. Amway, these high-pressure sales organizations. There's a very dramatic one in Europe in the 20th century. Remember that one? Hierarchical social structure. Your meaning and value is determined by your relationship to people above you, ultimately to your relationship with the leader. It's called, say it again?
Nazism?
Yeah, Nazi Germany. Hitler is the god king, the Führer, the leader. Your meaning and value in that civilization is dependent on your relationship to somebody above you, that person's to somebody above them, up to Hitler. What happens in 1937 or 1941 if your 9-year-old child hears you criticizing Hitler? What happens? That kid tells some Nazi youth leader, and next thing you know, your parents are taken away. You're not allowed to step outside of the social system. There's something also with the hierarchical social structure. It's called the military. When you're in the military, what's your job with relationship to people who are higher than you? That's right, you've got to obey. As soon as you say you're not going to obey, if it's peacetime, you're cashiered out. If it's wartime, you may be executed. You're not allowed to have a different opinion from your superiors. A hierarchical social structure. This next one, D, the psychology of the adversary, is also one of my favorites. I'm just curious if we could get a little interaction going here and ask, is there somebody in the room who could name an adversary that you have, either right now or that you had in your past? Can somebody name an adversary, personal adversary? Yes, Dave?
I would say Bill. I don't want to mention his last name.
Okay, so Bill was your adversary. And how old were you when you had this adversary?
Then I was in my 20s.
Okay, that's cool. That's good. On a more personal note, I had an adversary when I came into this world, and that is I was born in 1947, but my older brother Pete came in 3 years earlier. And when I arrived, he took a look at me and said, "No, this is not right." And I was like, bang, bang, bang. For the next 15 years, he just beat on me, he hit me, he slapped me. He used to get his fingers and go like that, like give me a dead finger on the ear. As soon as my parents were out of earshot, Pete was attacking me. Spitting on me, blowing his nose on me, just everything. And I like to sometimes give Pete the credit for the fact that I'm a sort of religious person. I've always been kind of a naturally religious person, always believed in God. And I think part of the reason for that is Pete was so cruel to me that I began to pray that God would kill him. Please, God. So I developed that devotional aspect. Please, God, please kill him. And of course, God didn't kill him. And then the next thing happened is he got to be 17, I was 15, and then we became friends. And he's 69, and I'm 67, and I'm glad he's alive. We're great friends, and he is my friend and my supporter. So, but when we talk about the psychology of the adversary in general terms, and for our purposes today, I'm talking about Chinese communism under Mao Zedong. Anybody who's not inside the Chinese communist movement is automatically, a capitalist running dog, and they need to be executed. They need to be wiped out. If you're in Hitler's Germany, the adversary is the Jews. You don't need to think about it. You just need to accept that they're the bad people. They need to be wiped out. They need to be controlled. Ultimately, they need to be exterminated. So when you get into the presence of what I would describe as religious absolutism or psychological absolutism, you get this thing, and it's like, we are the real people, we are the true people, we are the children of God, and everybody who disagrees with us is on Satan's side, and they ultimately are going to be destroyed. Again, I return to some of the remarks that Dave made earlier about taking dominion of the earth and, the final revelation or the final battle between good and evil. You always see that with the psychology of the adversary. If you think about it, whenever any human group gets together to fight against some other group, they spend a lot of time, especially if it's warfare, they spend a lot of time training the young men who are going to be killing the other guys to, you practice killing them. And you're not thinking, they're the children of God. God loves them too. No, when you get your rifle with the bayonet on the end of it and you're lunging it into some kind of, dummy, you're not going, Jesus, please forgive them. You're going, like that, and you're saying to yourself, die, and the language that you use to describe the enemy is always demeaning. It's always depersonalizing them. It's taking away from their humanity. Psychology of the adversary. On one level, it's sort of built into popular culture. Think about high school football teams. Think about a high school football rally Friday night before the game on Saturday. What are they all doing? Kill them, crush them, beat them, smash them. You got 3,000 young people all howling and screaming and yelling about how they're going to destroy the enemies, where are they from 5 miles down the road at some other high school. All right. Number E, the ends justifies the means as a modus operandi. The ends justifies the means. In the Unification Church, the language would be simply, where we're going is the kingdom of heaven. We're going to a place where all people get together, where all cultures are harmonious. We're going to a place where disease has been overcome, where human suffering has really been put to an end. And because we're going to that place, and it's such a good place, then it's okay for us to kind of, make some mistakes now. So we may have to, if Yanya kind of doesn't understand what we're doing, we may have to kind of roll over her or crush her or kill her or move her aside, because where we're going is so good, everybody will be grateful that we get there. So the human errors that are made right now don't really count. They're not really important. And in the end, even Yanya will be grateful that we crushed her, because she knows that she was not on board with God's plan for the future. So the ends justifies the means is also an expression of that philosophical error which I like to talk about, and that is the idea that an idea is more important than a human being. And part of what I got from having been in the Moonies for 4.5 years and getting out and getting into a recovery process and talking to former cult members in the Moonies, but also in other groups, is that I do not believe that there's an idea that exists that's more important than a human being. I think as soon as you say an idea is more important than a person, then you're willing to eliminate people in the service of the idea. What is it? It's back to my title. It's an idol. When we worship an idea, when we submit ourselves or some other people to an idea, we're performing what's called idolatry. I think it's one of the geniuses of the early Hebrew or Jewish religious thinkers when they came up with the Ten Commandments. I believe God gave it to them, that's fine. But what is it? What's that commandment? Thou shalt make no graven images. How does it go? Do that? Which one is that? What does it say? Could somebody help me on that? Yeah.
Thou shalt not make any graven images. We're not supposed to make.
Yeah, you're not wish. Thou shalt not make any graven images. But that's a kind of a tough order. Do you know why? Do you know why it's tough to not make graven images? Does anybody know? That's the only thing we do. We make graven images all day long. What is a graven image? Well, it could be a picture, it could be a photograph, it could be an idol, but it's also simply an idea. What is an idea? It's an image. It's a picture. John Calvin, who's the founder of Presbyterianism, which I have a lot of issues with, he was kind of a psychological genius, and one of the things he said about human beings is, he said, the mind of man is an idol factory. What does he mean? What he means is we're all thinking all the time. We all have ideas all the time. And there's nothing wrong with having ideas. The problem is when we lock on to one of those ideas and we freeze it and we say, that's God. That's the truth. And if you look at that and you examine it historically, you find out that whenever people get to that place, they wind up sacrificing other people who don't happen to agree with that idea. So, I'm one of these strange characters who I believe in God, and always have. I'm kind of a naturally sort of spiritual guy, I guess. But I do not believe that God is private property. I don't believe that. And I think as soon as you find a group in history that believes that God is private property, you'll wind up seeing them doing bizarre things. You can take it back to Christianity in the first 2 or 3 centuries. Kind of didn't do much except help each other and love each other and have love feasts, eat bread, and take care of each other, kind of like social service organizations, doing a lot of great stuff. And then in the 4th century, Christianity falls into the hands of the Roman Empire under Constantine, and he turns it into a warrior religion. And 50 years before, if you were a Christian, you might be killed or persecuted or executed. Now Constantine turns the entire Roman Empire into a Christian realm, and if you're not a Christian, guess what? You may be crucified, executed, killed, burned, whatever, because you're not a Christian. It's like, to me, at that point, historically, human beings essentially lost touch with the teachings of Jesus. It's like, I love the stuff that Dave was telling us about all these different denominations trying to figure out how can we be the real Christians. We got to speak in tongues, we got to do this, we got to do that, and we'll be the real Christians, and then God will pour all his blessings and mercy on us. It's like, wait a sec. We lost it in the 4th century. Now there may be thousands and thousands, maybe millions of individual Christians who are great people, who are loving people, who are merciful people, people who embody, let's say, the Sermon on the Mount, things like that. That's great. As soon as it turns into a group and the group's got a leader and he's telling everybody, guess what, we got it and they don't, watch it. First thing's going to happen is you start taxing everybody. They tithing 5%. Now you got to tithe 50%. And on the backside of that, you know what? You also got to let me, abuse your daughters and your sons and whatever else I want to do. Why? Because, I'm the messenger. No, you're not. You find somebody who's God's messenger. My encouragement to you would be question them, question them, question them, and then question them.
Run the other way.
Yeah, and then run the other way. That's right. All right. What happened? Where did it go? It went away.
Sleep mode.
Is that it? Oh, you got to stay active, or won't let you do it?
I think it's just it times out.
Time's down, okay. It's like if you don't pay enough attention to the teachings, then the devil gets you. Okay. So the end justifies the means. Of course, you see that theme. We see it over and over again in movies, in TV programs, in literature. You see it in the Bible. And, to me, the ends and the means have to be similar. They need to be connected. If you want to create a good result, you have to take good steps to get there. In the Moonies, we were always told that the pain and the suffering and the misery that our movement may cost to other people is actually, it's a form of payment. Those people are in the hands of Satan. They're in the hands of the satanic world, and they don't have the right yet to know the truth that Mr. Moon is bringing. And so when we're interacting with the world in a way which is painful to them, that's what's called indemnity. This is the term the Moonies use to explain how they're allowed to lie, cheat, and steal from people out in the outside world. And Mr. Moon used a metaphor for this that he got from the Old Testament, and that is the story of Esau and Jacob, the brothers. And Esau is the elder brother, and so he's going to inherit the blessing, but actually God doesn't really like him. He likes Jacob more. And so he talks to Jacob and says, Jacob, you get to go and steal the blessing from your brother. And so he talks to his mother. His mother says, what you do is you put lamb's wool on your arms, and you go to your father Isaac and say, hey, Dad, here I am, Esau for the blessing. And half-blind Isaac goes, you don't sound like Esau, you sound like Jacob. And he puts his arms out and he says, feel my arms. And so Isaac touches his arms, and Esau was a real hairy guy. So when Isaac touches the arms, he says, oh yeah, you are Esau. And so he gives him the blessing of the first son. And of course, in that world, you can't take the blessing back. Jacob's got it now. He stole the blessing from his older brother Esau. And then, of course, Mr. Moon says, you look at Jacob. Well, out of Jacob come the 12 tribes of Israel. Ultimately comes Jesus, Moses, all these great figures. They come from Jacob. And then Mr. Moon says, rhetorically, to all of us young Moonies who are being trained, he says, who is Jacob? And then he points to himself. It's not me. And he says, I am the universal Jacob. I am God's messenger at this time. I have been sent to fulfill the will of God, which was not fulfilled through Jesus. And he said, what is our relationship to people outside our movement? We are Jacob, and they are Esau. What's our job? Our job is to steal the birthright from Esau. What does that mean? That means nobody inside the Unification Church is obliged to tell the truth to anybody on the outside. Sorry, what's your first name?
Sharina.
Sharina, I like you, but you're not in the movement, so I get to lie to you. So I get to go to knock on your door as a fundraiser, raising money, and I'm selling candles or peanuts or flowers or whatever, and you say, what's this for? And I look you right in the eye and I say, well, it's for a program we have working in prisons. And you go, wow, that's really nice. And so you ante up $5 or $10. And of course, we don't have a prison program. That money goes straight to Mr. Moon. And what he's doing with it is he's buying influence in Washington. He's buying congressmen and senators. I don't mean to offend anybody if you happen to be a Republican. But what you need to know about the Republican organization nationally is Mr. Moon has been pouring money into that thing from 1973 on. Ronald Reagan, the Moonies pushed to get him in. Bush 1, they pushed to get him in. Bush 2, twice. Moonies completely behind that. Why? These are people who were helping build a giant pyramid in the United States. Know what we're getting now? Does anybody know what we're getting now in the United States in terms of the structure of our democracy? Anybody know about that? The top is getting bigger and bigger and more powerful, and the people at the bottom are getting squeezed more and more and more. And it looks like large corporations are really going to be able to kind of undo democracy. Well, guess who wanted to do that? Mr. Moon. Who else? Well, the Church of Scientology, the Hare Krishnas, the Way International. Any of these kind of, dictatorial outfits, they always wind up moving to the right. They don't go towards progressive politics. Yeah, shoot.
Back to the wool. Is that where the expression of wool from sheep's clothing comes from?
I think so. I think it's similar. Yeah, it's the same metaphor. Yeah, yeah. There's something else on this one. One of the things you can discern if you look carefully at American politics between the time Reagan was elected and now is the intrusion or the entrance of religion into politics. And who spearheads it? Well, the Moonies do, but also all these evangelical Christian organizations, they're all moving to try to get religious law to be political law. What does that mean? It means there'll be no difference between religious law and political law. Do you know where that exists already?
Islam.
What?
Islam?
Yeah, Islam. Not just Islam generally, but in Saudi Arabia, some of these countries, it's like religious law and political law are one. So it's kind of it's a sort of ironical and it's sort of paradoxical that in the United States, many of the people who want to annihilate Islam, who are all fired up about, God needs to destroy Islam because it's a satanic religion, well, actually, they've already instituted what these fundamentalist Christians want to institute here. What's that? It's the union of political and religious law. You break the law, you're not just a bad person or antisocial, you're a demonic person and you're going to hell. And we might need to send you there quickly. Ouch.
Can I ask to just mention,
Yeah.
I think in some ways you're almost being too generous because, I think especially some of those extremists are not even wanting the political system, they're just wanting a theocracy.
That's right. That's right.
Any semblance of
That's right. Total theocratic dictatorship. One of the things that Mr. Moon said to us along these lines back in a conference I was attending in 1973, he said the thing that God hates the most is the separation between church and state. He said what God wants is a theocratic dictatorship. And that's not me speaking, that's Mr. Moon. It's a quote from Mr. Moon. I'm saying, okay, that's right. We need to have Mr. Moon controlling everything. Yeah, that'll be great. Ouch. All right. I don't know what time is it. Glory, what time is it? So we're doing okay at the time. All right. All right. Crisis psychology. The inner circle, this is a phenomenon you see in all these groups, and Dave also touched on it this morning, and that is the thing of when you touch one of these organizations, especially if you touch it through its recruiters, you don't see what's really going on. You're in Berkeley on the street, or you're coming out of a bus station in New York, and you meet a Mooney recruiter, they don't know what's going on either. What they do to you is they love you, they pay attention to you, they listen to you, they make eye contact, and they affirm you. And the next thing you know, they're inviting you to have a coffee with them or to come to a lecture that's being given on how we can get cultures to interact with each other in a peaceful way. It all sounds nice, especially if you're innocent and ignorant. But when you get into this organization, what you find out, it's like a giant onion. There's layer after layer after layer. And after you're in for a while, you find out that actually there's some things going on you didn't know about at first, or the person who recruited you didn't tell you. And when you find out about it, it's like, oh, wow, it's kind of weird or strange. But by this time, you've already committed to the organization. And so this thing that appears to be strange or distasteful or maybe even a little bit not quite right, it's shared with you as though you are learning a divine secret. And you get to carry it as though that's part of your growth and development as a spiritual person is, you get to know some of the junk that's happening inside the organization. And you begin to think about the junk as a sort of sacred mission that you get to carry it and not tell other people. So you don't tell brand new people coming in. Is that your name again?
Sharina.
So Sharina says, well, what about this? I said, well, yes, that's true, but we shouldn't let the brand new ones know that because that might drive them away. We don't want that. So Sharina begins to lie to the brand new ones about what's really going on in the organization. And of course, when I joined the Moonies, the big lie was he was a pure virgin until he was 40 years old. And I can remember hearing that and thinking, that's pretty intense. I was 23 and I was not a pure virgin at that stage. but I remember thinking, and also I read a lot of yoga stuff about people who don't have sex consciously for some sort of religious person, that person stores up power. And I remember thinking, boy, Mr. Moon must be really powerful. He hasn't had sex and he's 40. Anyway, so that was part of the ticket that kind of seduced me into thinking this is a genuine religious leader. And so I was in the organization, and I was there for a year in Washington, and then I was made this political leader in the organization. Next thing you know, I'm being sent out to Asia, and I get to meet Mr. Moon in Korea, and I meet these Japanese Unification Church members. And it's all very exciting and, kind of really stimulating my ego. I'm thinking I'm this great guy because I'm so young, and they're already identifying me as a leader. And while I was in Japan, I was invited to go out to dinner with a bunch of young Japanese Moonie leaders. And when I was there at dinner, I got introduced to this young Korean guy who was 24 years old. And it turns out this young Korean man was one of Mr. Moon's sons. My little brain went, wow, man, now I'm really, in the catbird seat. And I shook hands with him, talked to him. He was a nice guy. And then I kind of began to do the math. And he was 24 in 1970. That means he was born in 1946. But the Moonie teaching was Mr. Moon was a pure virgin till 1960. Doesn't add up. Doesn't add up. A little cognitive dissonance there. But by that time, I'd been in the organization 16 months. I'd been praying in Mr. Moon's name for 16 months. And I saw all these people around me who were sacrificing everything to promote the strength of the movement and the power of Mr. Moon. And then later, when I got back to Washington, I talked to Ms. Kim. And I loved her. She was one of the Moonie missionaries. And she was in Washington. And she was, I would describe her as a very kind of beautiful and encouraging, intelligent, sensitive person. And she said, well, yes, this is true. The master did have an earlier relationship, but it didn't work out. But he's persevered and carried on, and he still is God's representative. Okay. And then she said, I want to go with you down to President Jefferson's house, Monticello, down there in Virginia. And she said, I want us to go down there. So I drove her down in his car. We walked all over Monticello, beautiful gardens. And as we were walking through the gardens, she began to give me this other teaching which wasn't written down. And that was, well, if you look at great figures in history, great prophets or sages or holy men, great leaders, often their personal lives aren't as nice as their public life. And so she began giving me examples of great leaders who had illegitimate children, or who had things in their past that weren't that great. And then she turned back to Mr. Moon and said, well, that son Sajin is not just the only. There actually were some other liaison, and Mr. Moon had 2 or 3 other children that the mother didn't work out. And I'm saying, okay, it's like, wait a minute. But I kind of just pushed it aside. It's like I drew a circle around it and pushed it aside and didn't think about it. I was in the organization another 2 years before I really woke up. So the inner circle is part of these organizations. You don't find out until later what's really going on. So, the inner circle. Oh, I skipped crisis psychology. Let me go to that. Am I on deck here? I can see it here, but okay, there we go. Too fast. Skip crisis psychology. I want to give you an example of crisis psychology in these organizations, and particularly the Moonies, and that is, I knew a young woman in England who spent a year at the Unification Church, and then her parents had her kidnapped and deprogrammed, and she got all the way out. But she was talking to me about being recruited and about the first 3 or 4 months in the organization. I said, what happened? And she said, well, I met these guys coming out of the bus station in San Francisco, and one guy was 20 feet behind me, and one of them said, hey, excuse me. And she turned around, and she was not in the habit of listening to guys trying to pick her up. She was kind of got good boundaries, kind of strong-willed, sort of self-directed person. And this guy looked at her and he said, excuse me, are you from England? And she said, well, yes. And she'd forgotten the fact that she had a Union Jack flag pasted to the back of her blue jeans. So it was like, there was a big sign back there saying, hey, I'm from England. But she'd forgotten that. She said, yeah. And then the second guy stepped up and he said, well, hey, I'm from England too. And it turned out he was from the same county in England that she was from, and they spoke the same kind of language. And the next thing you know, she's off into a coffee shop with them, and they're talking about this and that. And then they tell her about this great place in Northern California where they're doing these cultural experiments and getting people from all different cultures to live together. And hey, why didn't she come up? And she's very adventurous. And she says, cool. That night she's on a bus up to a Mooney training camp in Northern California. And they haven't told her a thing about Mr. Moon or about religion or about 7 days later, she's been through a 7-day workshop, and she's now a member of the organization. And she's walking through the training center, and these two guys who witnessed to her came up to her, and she looks at him. She looks him right in the eye, and she says, thank God you lied to me when we first talked.
Oh.
If you hadn't lied to me, I wouldn't have joined. Okay, so now she's done a 7-day workshop. Then she signs up for a 21-day workshop. She completes that, and guess what you get after the 21-day workshop? Then you get a 40-day workshop. After the 40-day workshop, she is there with the other participants who've gone through. They're thoroughly brainwashed, thoroughly indoctrinated. Young Mooney commander comes out and he says, you people who have completed this training session, your lives are extremely important. You're kind of like the tip of the spear in our organization. And what you're going to do in the next year, 2 or 3, is going to have world historical significance. They're all sitting there, eyes like this, okay, what is it, what is it? And he says, well, the last group that went out, like 40 of them were trained, they failed in their mission. And everybody's like, ooh, what does that mean? And then the guy says, because they failed in their mission, it set up a worldwide historical precedent which enabled the Russians to invade Afghanistan. So he says, what you're going to do when you go out on your mission is you're going to be victorious. And because you're victorious, Mr. Moon's going to be able to thread the eye of a historical needle, and he's going to be able to bring peace to the world. And what was their mission? You know what they were doing? What's that?
Selling flowers. Selling
flowers, peanuts, candies, candles. They were working 16 hours a day fundraising. Sometimes they'd earn between $300 and $800 a day. All that money went to Mr. Moon. What's he doing with it? Well, he's buying congressmen and senators. He's buying up businesses. Back in Korea, he's establishing an arms factory where he's producing weapons that are sold all over the world on the world market. Who buys the weapons? Anybody who has the money. But that kid who's on the street working for Mr. Moon believes he's serving God and serving the Messiah, and that the money's going to Mr. Moon, and Mr. Moon's going to do all kinds of great things to help people. But actually what's happening is this person is the victim of crisis psychology. Does anybody know an example of a crisis psychology in the United States in our history in the last 20 years or so? We had a moment of crisis. Anybody remember? 9/11. Say it again? 9/11. 9/11. What happened? What happened? We were attacked, right? Buildings exploded. 3,000 people are dead. What did our president do? The one who was supported by George Bush. What did he do? He used that event as an excuse to attack Afghanistan, and then right after that to attack Iraq. And, why did we kind of go along with that? Why did the United States, including most of our congressmen and senators, and also all the young people who joined the military, why did we go with what George Bush said? It's called crisis psychology. The reason we did is because we believed him. Just because a leader says something doesn't mean you're meant to believe him. In cult groups, because there's total communication control, you're not allowed to communicate with the outside world. There is no legitimate authority outside your organization. It doesn't matter if it's a minister, a priest, a friend, a family member. They don't know because they don't know the teaching of the great leader. They don't know the teaching of God's messenger. So they're not in a position to give you any kind of valid information. Inside destructive cult groups, they operate on a crisis psychology on a daily basis. It doesn't matter which group it is, that leader comes out and says, God has shown me, and everybody goes, uh-huh. And they all march off in one direction. You remember the stuff that the people in Jonestown were doing? Jim Jones's people down there in the jungle in Guyana. You know what they were doing at his behest? They practiced committing suicide. They practiced it. Not once. They did it time and time and time again. What were they doing? They were getting ready to, commit mass suicide. And so he just pulls a lever, crank, they all do it, and the few who stood up, they all got shot. Hey, wait a minute, I'm not sure I want to commit suicide. Sorry, too late, bad. Crisis psychology. Okay, so with the inner circle and crisis psychology, that's the sort of end of my formal presentation in terms of the structure of a destructive cult group, which uses religious language and religious metaphor. If you're in the presence of an organization which resembles this, what I would say is you're in the presence of a destructive cult. This is not some organization that's going to help people. I don't care what their theology is. I don't care what they say about all the good stuff they're going to do. If they're doing this, they're already abusing all of their members. And it's like the people who are in this system, they interpret the abuse as simply sacrifice. They're making sacrifices so that God can bring in the kingdom of heaven. As it turns out, we're going to have to roll over Yanya and Dave and Jan back there because they don't quite understand it correctly. But in the end, they'll be grateful that we killed them because it's going to help the kingdom of heaven. All right. Let's see if we go down a little bit here. So these are some elements that I think all of you are probably familiar with, but I'll just review them quickly. We're talking about recruitment and indoctrination. The first one is milieu control. That just simply means controlling the environment. One of the cult groups that I love is that one called EST, Earhart Seminars Training. They're pretty much shifted gears and they renamed themselves and they tried to modify themselves and make themselves more kind of people friendly. But back in the 70s, they'd have a workshop in a place like this, and they'd pack in 250 people, and when you got in, you weren't allowed to leave. You had to be there for 12 hours. And if you had to go to the bathroom, sorry, just pee in your pants. And you would have paid $500 for the weekend, and so you think something really good must be happening, so I probably should stay. And if you did get up to leave, the whole group would stand up and scream at you. You'd have total rejection and just total psychological attack. So, milieu control. So if you think about the Moonies, milieu control is you go into a workshop center outside of San Francisco or New York or Boston. You're 100 miles out in the country, and there's no exit. You're there for the weekend. And also, of course, in those days there was no cell phones, but if you needed to call somebody, you couldn't call. And if somebody called the center, they found out you were there, the call wouldn't be delivered to you. They wanted to completely control you and isolate you. And if we're at the workshop, if this was like a Mooney workshop, and it turned out that Mark decided halfway through that he wanted to leave, and he had talked with Yanya, and they were sort of friends, we found out that Mark was going to start arguing with us or be against what we're saying. We quickly move him out and just get him out of there so he wouldn't be disturbing the rest of the participants. And then Yanya asks about it and says, well, where's Mark? And we said, he had a family emergency, and so he had to go back to San Francisco. Control of the environment, control of the information that's coming in, control of the information that's coming out. One of the things I like about this one is that it's connected to the communication web, and it's the manipulation of intimacy, and that is throughout the workshop, we'll have presentations, and then we'll have group activities, we'll have meals, we'll have hikes in the woods, and sort of group games we play. And in the middle of it, Sharina's here, and let's say that Mark is sitting on one side of her, and I'm sorry, in the back? Michelle's sitting over here. And the thing that Sharina doesn't know is these people are already part of our organization. They're part of the workshop staff. But she's sitting there with them throughout the presentations in the week, during the weekend. And during this course, one of the things that happens is she starts talking to these people, and then she shares with them. And they share with her, and she begins to feel close to them. And at some point, Mark shares with her some really deeply emotional thing about his life and what's happening with him, and it really strikes a chord with her. She gets emotional too. And she begins to share things with them, and she mentions to Michelle that maybe when she was little, she really loved playing with dolls. Michelle brings that information back to the workshop director and shares that with him. And so later in a presentation, I mentioned something about childhood. I mentioned that our childhood is so important, and it's especially important that children be free to play imaginatively and maybe, to play with their dolls. And Sharina's there, and she's going, wow, man, these people really know where it's at. And they do. Where it's at is your heart. And the purpose of the workshop is to get into your heart and feed it back to you as though we were people who were concerned about your heart. The workshop directors are not concerned about your heart. They want to know what it is so they can reach in and grab it. It could be that you were a Pittsburgh Steelers fan. He'll weave that into the conversation. I'll never forget the day I was in Pittsburgh and they were down 21-7. Came back in the fourth quarter, smashed them. Yeah, Pittsburgh. The end justifies the means. We get to use whatever you share with us to overthrow you, to overthrow your imagination, to take control of your consciousness, to take control of the way you think and the way you imagine yourself, the way you speak to yourself about yourself. We're going to try to get in there and give you language and terms and metaphors which you will begin to use to explain to yourself what your life means. So, I'm going to jump down here to this one. I guess I'm kind of jumping ahead of myself. Number G, the repudiation of the conscience, the rejection of the critical faculties, and the colonization of the imagination understood as an experience of God. We experience inside a workshop like this that our thinking process, our worldview is overthrown. And if we accept what they say, we have now entered this world where we don't have to do our own thinking. People above us will tell us what to think. They will show us the guidelines for how we should live our life, what we should do, who we should hang out with, what enterprises we should engage in. But the person experiences this as though it were a revelation. They experience it as though they've met God. And one of the things that happens at the end of the workshop is the workshop director, one of the young guys or ladies, comes out and says, "We're so glad you came and shared with us this weekend. We're so glad you let us share with you our hope for the future." And I'm aware of the fact that many of you this weekend had intense emotional experiences, and you really felt like your heart was touched, and you were moved by what took place here. And some of you felt really connected to us. But I'm also aware of the fact that during this weekend, some of you felt resistance, and you felt like you didn't like this, and that you wanted to get away from us. And what I want you to know now is that from where we sit, from where we stand, we see that as the battle between God and Satan. God is calling you to us. He wants you to join us in this great enterprise. Satan wants to pull you away from us take you away from God. And at that point, if the workshop has been successful, a lot of people are feeling that. They feel attracted to these people. Part of me wants to get away, push, pull. And if you accept that picture, it's like they've got the hook not in your mouth, but down your throat. You know, the next thing you know, why don't you stay for the 7-day workshop? And the hook goes deeper. Part of the picture I get of these organizations is they don't really believe that human beings are real unless they're in the organization. Everybody outside the organization is a potential person. But as a potential person, they're still kind of in the satanic realm. And the only way they get to be in the heavenly realm is to come in, join our organization, and submit. And of course, the world I live in today is a world in which nobody is in possession of the absolute truth. We all may have pieces of the truth, and we all may be working on being truthful, which I think is a great idea. But to me, the kind of red flag for me is when I bump into somebody who's got the absolute truth, and part of me just wants to back up a little bit. And of course, I've met a lot of people who did have the absolute truth, and many of them were alcoholics and addicts. You know about that? So, this doesn't hurt me, I'm fine. Yeah, I can have another, I'm okay. No, you're not. Yes, I can. Yes, I can. You get them into treatment, and what do they do in treatment? They spend a whole lot of time trying to pretend and convince you that they're getting the picture. And they're not. They're lying. And they're lying in service of what? Continuing to use a substance which is attacking their nervous system, making it difficult for them to make, responsible decisions about their life and their family and their work. And it's amazing how similar the active addict is to the active cult member. The active cult member will do anything they can to continue worshiping something which is dominating and controlling them and hasn't the least interest in them as a human being or a person. And of course, if you talk to an alcoholic or an addict who gets into recovery or cleans up enough, and they have some language skills or they're literary in some way, often they'll write beautiful poetry about their addiction, and they often refer to their addiction as God. It was my God, or it was my lover. I remember being in the Moonies, and I remember loving Mr. Moon. And I think this is just part of my personal psychology. All my life, I've always been a hero worshiper. I love heroes. It's Hercules or some Greek hero or something. Or even later, religious or spiritual heroes. I love Gandhi. I love Martin Luther King. And when I met Mr. Moon, part of the way I absorbed him in my little imagination was I just sort of superimposed all those religious heroes onto him. And I sort of projected onto him that he was this great person who was going to help us all move into the kingdom of heaven. And what I found out, living my life afterwards, is that there's all kinds of goodness inside me. It doesn't mean I'm God or I'm perfect. It just means there are things that I love and value, and I love and value those things, and I'm pursuing them today. But it doesn't mean that I'm meant to superimpose my will on somebody else. At this point in the talk, I would say maybe, but except for maybe Mark, I would like to dominate him and control him.
I already have. So.
You already got it. Okay, hey, if he's taken, I'll switch here. Maybe Sharina. Maybe I can just control Sharina. That'll be cool. What else? I'd just like maybe to give you one anecdote from my life in the Moonies. Again, you've got to imagine this 23-year-old kid who's full of egotism and hope and, wanting to make a difference. When I got to Japan, in addition to meeting Mr. Moon's son, one of the things that happened to me there, I was introduced to this Japanese political and business leader whose name was Ryoichi Sasakawa. And in 1970, Sasakawa was the president of 13 Japanese corporations. He was the president of the largest shipbuilding firm in the world. He was also the ceremonial leader of all martial arts organizations in Japan. So in effect, he was the, what's that guy called in Japan? The big kahuna? He was the He was the shogun. He was the shogun of Japan. Well, and he was also a Japanese fascist youth leader in the 30s and 40s, and when it got into the late 30s, he was a kind of political figure, and he helped set up the Hitler-Tojo Pact. So he helped connect Japan and Germany for World War II. Well, after the war, he was convicted as a Class A war criminal, spent 3 years in jail, and just thinly escaped getting executed. Well, when he got out of jail, all the Japanese press ran to interview him, and when they interviewed him, they said, so, what do you think? What do you think? Sasakawa says, well, the only thing wrong with World War II is we lost. It's like, okay, this is who this guy is. So I am taken to meet this guy because he is, turns out, one of Mr. Moon's supporters, and he was part of the financial backing behind this huge political conference and demonstration they had, sort of big anti-communist fest, where they invited people from all over the world, plus they had our Senator Strom Thurmond as the big representative from the United States. I meet Sasakawa, and you need to understand these remarks in terms of Sasakawa being a Japanese man in relationship to Korea. The Japanese brutalized Korea, enslaved Korea, used Korean citizens as slaves, women as prostitutes for the army, the horrible treatment of Koreans. Sasakawa tapped his chest and looked me right in the eye and he said, I am Mr. Moon's dog. I'm getting the picture that the most powerful man in Japan is telling me that he's the servant of Mr. Moon. I didn't have that much knowledge at the time, but my mind put it together. This organization is very powerful, and they are going to take over the world. And then I go back to Washington, D.C., and next thing I know, we're printing articles in the paper defending Richard Nixon. And the next thing you know, Mr. Moon is invited to the White House, and there are all these photo ops with Nixon and Moon, with their arms around each other. So I think I'm going to let that be the sort of end of my formal remarks, but I'd be happy to take any kind of questions you have on anything. Yes?
When did Moon take over the Washington Times?
He created it.
Oh, he created it.
He created it, yes. He said to me in 1970 when I met with him, he said, part of my job as the political leader of the Moonies in America, I was the president of the Freedom Leadership Foundation. He said, your job is to penetrate social institutions. Your job is to make friends with congressmen and senators. He said you will find that the easiest way to do that is with the Republican or the right-wing congressmen and senators because they are all anti-communist. We will beat the anti-communist drum and that will open the door for us to go in. He said beyond that, your job will be to make friends with the police forces and with the intelligence agencies, with the FBI and the CIA, and also to make friends with people in the military. And his whole strategy was about penetrating social institutions. He said you also will need to begin to cultivate professors on university campuses, to attend them, to go to their classes, to listen to them, to help them with their work or their research. So his whole strategy was about just penetrating and taking control. Did I answer the question?
So he started the newspaper?
Yeah, he started the Washington Times, I think, probably at the end of the 70s, maybe 78. He had a paper in New York, which went for about a year and a half, then folded, then he did the Washington Times. And that paper was very influential, and I think it's still influential in the Republican or right-wing world. Anything that is attacking progressives, anything attacking Democrats, the Washington Times is always on top of it and projecting it and lying about it. And
who controls it now?
well, it's been sold and bought back and forth, and I think one of his sons is in charge of it, but I'm not sure exactly.
It's still the organization.
It's still doing the right-wing thing. Plus, journalists who work for the Washington Times get to be talking heads on Sunday and these TV shows in New York where, they have people, pundits sitting around a table talking about what's going on. You often have a Washington Times person there essentially blasting the sort of right-wing picture of things.